Welcome to the Her Health Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
I want to welcome everyone to the Her Health Podcast, where we explore the ideas, the innovations, and people transforming mental health and the social services for women, girls, and gender diverse people affected by violence and adversity. I'm your host, Alexandria Lozowchuk, and today we're really honored to be joined by two powerhouse leaders in the gender-based violence sector, Andrea Silverstone and Carrie McManus from Sagesse. Andrea is the CEO of Sagesse and is an internationally recognized advocate, innovator, and policy leader. She is known for disrupting systems of abuse and creating impact through bold, community-rooted approaches, from championing Clare's Law into Alberta to launching innovative frameworks for domestic violence prevention. And Carrie McManus is the Director of Innovation and Programs at Sagesse and a driving force behind initiatives that challenge outdated service models and expand support to underdeserved communities, including informal supporters, rural populations, and people involved in sex work. So together, they co-authored Innovation at the Back of a Bus, which is a compelling call to action for civil society organizations to reimagine how they adapt to complexity, center equity, and embrace innovation. And the recent AVA webinar by the same name sparked deep conversations about what it takes to create systems of change in the face of growing social need and limited resources. In this episode, we'll talk about their vision for the future of community-led innovation and what it really means to build systems that work for people most often left behind. So thank you so much, Andrea and Carrie, for joining today.
Thank you so much for having us.
We'll dive in. Your book and the webinar argue that innovation is no longer optional, it's essential. So why do you think that the civil society sector, especially organizations addressing gender-based violence, needs to reimagine how it works right now?
So maybe I'll start by sharing with you a thought from a quote from Eric Hoffer. And Eric Hoffer talks about how the future is going to be inherited, and those who are going to succeed in the future are not the learned, but the learners. I think that traditionally speaking, we've always very valued this idea of the learned and people who have lots of information and people who look backwards into like what the research before us and what the evidence before us said. And I think that for us, for our organization, and I think for society generally, COVID was a massive wake-up call. We are in a different time in the world than we ever were before. And I think that what we need to do is be learners, and being a learner means being innovative, adapting quickly, moving fast, but moving with hopefully some sense of precision while still being okay with the messiness of it. And so I think that that's why now more than ever we need innovation. Society feels more stressed out, more under-resourced, more overwhelmed than probably any other time before in history, and also more polarized.
Just to add to that, I think that if we think about the future and future forecast where we want to be, and future forecast what the path would look like if we keep doing the things that we're currently doing or using the models that we're currently using. When I think about it within the models that we currently have, I see a future of a lot of really passionate people being really burnt out and becoming disillusioned with the work and with the space and with what it costs us as service providers to do this. And I think that that leads to a much greater opportunity for harm. And so for me, the idea of innovation is the path that I see towards the future, where we all still have the bandwidth to do this kind of work, but we have the bandwidth to do it because we're seeing that there's opportunities for it to be different and for us to see a different outcome.
Innovation at the Back of the Bus is a very striking title for a book and a webinar. Can you share us about what that metaphor represents and why it feels like the right framing for your message?
I mean, I think that when we thought about innovation and we kind of thought about where are the spaces that it happens and how does it happen? And one of the things is I like to talk about Andrea and I as the people that sit in the back of the room and are kind of loud and they're those students who kind of sit in the back of the room and feel like they're not paying attention and maybe you're throwing paper airplanes, but what if we actually think about what's going on back there and what's happening? And so there was something to me about this concept of the back that felt really interesting. And when we tried to sort of root it, the bus was a really great analogy of, when you travel to the back of the bus, you have to walk by everybody. And so you see everything that is happening and you observe everybody and how are they engaging and where are they sitting and who's making space for people and who's not making space for people. There's something about being at the back of the bus that gives you this perspective that feels a little bit distant from being right in the middle of it, but allows you to see and understand the mechanics and the play of how all of that is working and how people are engaging and showing up. And there's also something to me when I think about the back of the bus that is a little bit less comfortable and it's pretty bouncy and sometimes it feels a little like you're gonna hit your head on the ceiling because it's messy and it's kind of uncomfortable. And innovation is messy and kind of uncomfortable. I think that innovation when you're sitting in the middle is about saying, I'm going to take this thing that I already know works and I'm going to put a slight tweak onto it. Whereas I think sitting at the back of the bus is innovation is about saying, I have no idea. I know enough things based off of what I can see in the people in front of me that I think we could try this, but I have no idea. And it might end up hitting my head and it might hurt a lot.
Thank you for really diving into the metaphor of innovation on the back of the bus and saying that innovation is messy. You both lead or transformative work in rethinking how services are delivered. And what are some of the business as usual practices in this sector that you believe actually hold us back from really achieving real impact?
So it's interesting, this question makes me reflect on a conversation I actually had yesterday. I think that is about our business as usual. One of the things that, of course, all of us struggle with is our capacity to have core funding that supports our organizations to run and allows us to feel free from the tyranny of trying to figure out where the next dollar is coming from. So I was having a conversation with someone about that particular issue. And so for me, when I think about it, what we need to do is actually reimagine the whole system. We need to reimagine how funding happens. Carrie and I talk a lot about how the dollars have to follow the data, even if it's uncomfortable data, even if like things that we thought were true actually aren't true. I think we have to reimagine how we serve clients. One of the things that we've done is really recognize that us as social service experts, whether it's psychologists or social workers, are a very small part of the picture. Informal supporters are a much bigger part of the picture, right? So it's a whole reimagining. And when I was having the conversation with these stakeholders yesterday, who said to me, okay, so you're telling me that funding is a real issue. So are you thinking that what we need to do is advocate for like a cost of living increase every year for the sector? And I'm like, no, that's not a big way of thinking about things. It's not a reimagining. And I understand why that comment came. It's because everyone feels so battered down by the systems that they're like, maybe if I just ask for this little bit, I'll get it. But I think that what's happened is that's business as usual. And business as usual is never going to get us out of the rut that we're in. And it's never going to reimagine a different way of being. We are purposely keeping ourselves small.
I think that business as usual is a part of the challenge of this is about recognizing that at all levels, right? So Andrea just gave a great example of like the highest level that we can have around reimagining. And I will give an example of, earlier today I was meeting with one of our staff who is responsible for our service delivery that includes volunteers. And we know that volunteerism is changing. How people volunteer, why they volunteer, how much they want to volunteer, all of that is changing. There's really great evidence about that. We are a service delivery model that is 100% reliant on volunteers. And so in some ways, the business as usual practice is to say, we need to get stronger at our model. We need to take our model. We need to lock it down. We need to get really, really clear about it. But what I said was, take the next 3 months, tell me, what do we know about the research? what do we know about our own volunteers? Because research is great, but are our volunteers following the same trend as what we see and hear, or are volunteers doing something different? And then draw for me a line of where the gaps are, so that instead of going into the next funding ask or the next programmatic review or whatever and saying we're going to be business as usual, what we can do now is say, well, we can see where our business as usual is not going to work anymore and figure it out. And maybe it means taking our existing model for how we do volunteerism and throwing it out and coming up with a whole new model. I don't know. And I think that part of what people get really scared about when we talk about innovation is they assume that what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the existing model, I'm going to throw it out, and I'm going to start fresh. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give her 3 months to put together a ton of information that then is going to allow us to look at that and go, we now have enough information to know where we can innovate, where we get rid of business as usual practices, and where we double down on what we know to be true, even if the research and the evidence doesn't say it. Because if research says one thing about volunteering, but our research says something different, let's not solve a problem that we don't actually have. But I think that business as usual practice is really about not getting scared about what it means to actually look at what you're doing and be willing to say, I'm doing something that's not working anymore, which is hard. And it's hard on my ego to say I built this thing and actually it's broken.
Thank you so much for diving into both those excellent examples and kind of giving our listeners a better example of what business as usual practices could look like in the different areas. I really appreciate it. Your work at Sagesse really emphasizes this like trauma and violence informed care, gender transformative approaches, and very much a big focus on community leadership. How do you put these principles into practice, especially when you're working, as you mentioned earlier, limited timing, funding, or staffing or capacity?
The first thing that we have to do is get our values really straight. We have to know what they are, and we have to not figure those out as we go along. And by the way, we are very much, let's figure this out as we go along. People, we're a build the plane as we fly it. But I think that there are certain things that you can't figure out as you go along. And I think one of them is your core values. And at Sagesse, we've spent a lot of time thinking about what our core values are and how they manifest, and making sure that as much as possible, everyone who is making decisions, which is really every one of our staff members and our volunteers, understand what our core values are. And so no matter what, no matter how messy it gets, we get to fall back on our core values, and our core values embrace those things that you talked about. They embrace belonging, they embrace equity, they embrace inclusion, they embrace the human experience of the messiness of all of those things. And it also embraces our vulnerability. And so I think that for me, that is the core piece. It's be very clear about our values. And then the second piece is that and I know that this is like cheesy, but the personal is political. And so it's really important also to do our own personal work and understand what that actually means. And how do we bring our personhood into this work that we do? And how do we bring other people's personhood?
And I think that when you think about our work sort of grounded from those places, it's an interesting question, because I actually have such a blind spot to I don't know how we would do this work as we are in the things that we value and believe without inherently coming from those perspectives, right? Without inherently believing in community leadership. We know we're not the experts in all things. We know that we have expertise in some things, but we don't have that in everything. And so I think that we've created a model that actually is not about, I don't think on a daily basis, how are we applying these principles or these models of practice into our work? I think that they are so deeply built into our systems and our perspectives and our values that when I feel it coming up, when I feel the sort of crunch of time or funding or capacity, it's because somebody or something or some system wants me to do something that doesn't fit within that. Somebody has said to me, I want you to deliver this program, and no, you don't have time to talk to community about what community wants and how they want to do that. That's the time where we feel like those principles are not able to be found. But I think because of the fact that we've done our deep work as an organization and as individuals, it really, really allows us to have that knowledge and capacity around these things are just a core part of. They're not a something that we add because we know that it looks good or is important or is the model of practice of the day kind of thing.
You both brought up such excellent points, and it's a little bit of a side tangent of like my personal experiences through schooling and academia is that a lot of I'm learning about like implementation sciences, science and innovation and implementing innovations. And it seems very apolitical from the university standpoint. So I'm really glad to hear from you, Andrea, that the personal is political, especially when it comes to the communities that you serve. So I really appreciate you emphasizing that point. So the lessons from like your lived experience and power sharing. So one of the key takeaways in your work that you do is the importance of co-creation with people who have lived experience. So what have you learned about sharing power meaningfully with communities?
I think that the first thing that we learned is you cannot walk in and believe that you are the expert. But you do have to walk in and understand that you have expertise. There's a big difference. And I think sometimes we can flagellate the two things.
And you can't assume all of the power, but you have to know you have power in a similar mindset, right? We spend a lot of time in social services talking about power, dealing with power, being uncomfortable with power. I think that we spend a lot of time in there's sort of, I feel like there's this sort of spectrum of community engagement where we go in and we say to communities, we have no power, you have all of the power, tell us everything. But versus other places where we go in and we say, I have all of the power and we're going to do this program, we're going to do it this way. Neither of those should be true. And neither of those is I think, sort of an effective model for that kind of engagement. I think that power sharing means having to acknowledge that there is power in the room and to inherently believe that power is not bad. We are, I think we spend so much time being worried about power and who has it and who doesn't have it, and all of it's going to be bad, which we then create this situation where anything that is about power or having it or not having it feels like it's got a negative sort of perspective. And I think that we actually need to really be able to say, power exists, power is here, power can be helpful and it can be really valuable, right? And there are times where we say in community, you don't have the power for that, but I have the power for that. And so let me take that on because I have the power to do this thing that you don't, and vice versa. And I think that the ability to acknowledge that and to invite that into the room and into the space is really, really important and necessary to have a co-creation process that's really authentic. Because otherwise, if I walk into the room and say, let's co-create, and I don't acknowledge the fact that at the end of the day, I sign off on content, I write all of these things that are the power that we have, then it feels like I'm just tokenizing the communities that I'm working with versus an authentic experience and an authentic engagement and an authentic opportunity for me to say, there are some things that you might say I don't like, and I'm going to say, sorry, we got to keep it, or we got to do it anyways, or whatever. But I think that sort of level of authenticity and transparency is also really important when kind of looking at that authentic co-creation.
I also think that there's something very uncomfortable about us saying that in order to listen to someone's voice and believe that they're giving us a voice of lived experience, they have to disclose their trauma to us. Mm-hmm. Right?
Checklist. Give me your checklist of why you're valid, why your trauma is valid.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I'm keenly aware of, one, if we talk about statistics, we say that 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence in their lifetime. The stats on men are, sort of all over the place, anywhere between 1 in 4, 1 in 6. We know that if that's the case, at least 70%, if not all of the population has experienced having a friend or family member that has been impacted by domestic abuse. Well, if that's the case, you know what? We all have lived experience. And we're all sitting around the table with some sort of lived experience of domestic abuse, just from different perspectives of the story or of gender-based violence. And so for me, I there's something that sits very wrong with me of making people disclose their trauma in order for us to take their voices seriously.
Both excellent points. And I would like to thank you, Carrie, for kind of talking about how power is inherent and is in every room, but not to be shy about it, and to know that sometimes it can be wielded as a tool to get to the innovations and like the benefits that you need for communities. Innovation always involves uncertainty and risk, especially in systems that can be risk averse. What helps you stay grounded in taking those bold steps while still being accountable to the communities you serve?
This issue is too big for us to not take risks because we have not solved this irretractable social issue. And so we have an obligation, and that obligation entails us taking risks. So I think that that's the first thing. I think it is as irresponsible to not take risks as it is to take risks. The responsibility lies somewhere in the middle of that. And I think that we have a tendency, like you said, we live in risk adverse systems. We have a tendency to default to no risk taking and think that that is the safer and more moral place to stand. And I would argue that it's actually not, that inaction in some ways is actually more unethical. In terms of the like, how do we hold that risk? Principles that we talk about in innovation, they're principles of thin slicing that Malcolm Gladwell talks about, where someone who has mastery and expertise sometimes is able to make a decision in a snap moment because of all of that, better than somebody who spends hours and hours and hours or years and years and years going over new data to them. Brene Brown talks about vulnerability and brave spaces. And Carol Dweck, who we also refer to in our book, talks about like having growth mindsets. And I think that we need all of those people to sort of help us to set frames around risk taking, but also to give us permissions for risk taking.
There's something really interesting to me about the sort of ethical responsibility that we have to actually acknowledge that if we don't take risk, if we stay in the status quo as the business as usual, we are collectively making a decision that people will continue to be harmed.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I often talk about, and I draw a varied level of responses to this, but often I talk about wanting to be able to close down Sagesse and lay off all my staff. And people have a really strong reaction to that, and they feel like we're always going to be needed. And I think there's something that's interesting to me about somebody who runs a domestic violence organization, that if I want to always run a domestic violence organization, then I inherently want for people to always be being harmed by domestic violence. Versus if I want to not run a domestic violence organization because I don't need to, then it shifts what I'm trying to do. And I still do intervention work, and I still work with people who are currently experiencing or being negatively impacted or harmed by domestic abuse. But it also allows me to be able to really understand that my goal should be to be out of work, because it means that people then are no longer being harmed. And I think that the way you look at risk shifts if you think about it from that sort of perspective of, why am I here and what am I trying to accomplish? And then your tolerance for risk becomes different, because it's saying that doing what we currently are doing isn't risky. It is risky. We see people who are being harmed, which means that there is risk to how we're currently operating. And so I think that it's a bit about a mind shift sort of switch in terms of that, and in terms of what risk is. And I think that it's also really important to say, and I've had people be concerned before because of what we do or how fast we move or thin slicing or things like that. I think that all of this is about finding the right balance and finding the line. If I tomorrow said, I'm going to fully start doing this new model of practice for all of this work, and I just came up with it, and it's not grounded in anything, and it's never been tried, and I have no parameters around safety around it, I would expect that Andrew would say, I don't think so. Maybe not today. So there has to be some line and some level, right? And part of what my work is to figure out what that line and that level is, and to push a little bit on all sides as we go to say, is this actually the right line, or does the line live over here? And I just don't know, because I've never asked that, or we've never tried that. But I think that saying that risk doesn't exist is the same as saying that power doesn't exist.
just learning about the causes of the causes and disrupting systems of abuse. So if you've mentioned the phrase disrupting systems of abuse, I believe in the webinar or the book, I can't remember. What does that mean in like a practical sense? And how does it shape the way that Sagesse kind of operates?
So it's interesting. We talk about it in systems, but also in terms of structure, because I think that there's structural issues that exist in society. And this is sort of where I would suggest that it has led us as an organization. And Carrie can talk more about the practical implications of it. We've been talking about abuse in the same way for a really long time, especially when it comes to intimate partner violence or domestic abuse or family violence. The cycle of violence, the power and control wheel, right? Like all of those things. Those are ways to understand perhaps what's going on, but they're descriptors, they're not structures. Structures are things like coercive control, patterns of behavior that remove an individual's sense of personal agency. Personal agency is a human right. It is a necessity for participation in society. Like it is a grounding piece, personal agency, right? So really what structures of abuse do is they remove an individual's personal agency. And so I think that when we think about the structures of abuse, we don't think about it in siloed ways. We think about it as a whole system or a whole structure, right? We see coercive control show up in lots of different ways. We see it show up in intimate partner violence and sexual exploitation. We see it show up in cults. We see it show up in gangs. We see it show up in extremist groups. We also see it show up in the court system, and we see it show up societally. And so I think that when we start thinking about it in terms of structures of abuse and not these siloed components or these siloed descriptors. The other thing is that the way that we talk about abuse right now is a series of events that usually are tied to the perpetrator, right? Did that person do these things to you? Which one I think gives all the power to the perpetrator, doesn't recognize sort of the individual experiences of coercive control, and also doesn't actually understand that what's important is not whether or not the perpetrator hit you or whether or not the perpetrator stopped you from doing something. What's important is your experience of that. Were you afraid, and did it stop you from being able to act in your own best interest? And when we describe things fully in regards to what happened to you, right, or the person who did that to you or the system that did that to you, we totally actually also remove your personal agency, because we're not saying to you, how did you contextualize that experience? How did you understand that? And so I think we make victims out of people that aren't and don't recognize victims that do exist.
You know, Andrea has talked so well about the impact on the clients that we are serving and the way that we sort of reinforce these sort of systems. And I think even just when I think about the language of disruption, I remember when we came up with that language and I like asked our comms person if I could use it. Sure, she was gonna shoot me down. And she was like, yep, you can use it. And I thought, really? This is so cool, because one, I think that this is what we want to be doing. But two, the thing that is so interesting to me is that it changes how our staff think about what they're doing. So does this change the work that Andrea and I pursue on a high level, and advocacy and systems and all of that kind of stuff? Absolutely. But it gives permission to our staff who are on the ground doing work to say, this feels like it needs a shakeup. This system is not working. What if? And so it allows them in all of the different ways that they show up on the ground with clients, with volunteers, with community partners and informal supporters and whomever. It allows them to also come at it from this place of what if, as opposed to, I'm here to represent a system that they just upholds, connects to, and cares about, right? Our staff go out into community with a bit of a lens of like, I'm here to be a bit of a disruptor. And I'm going to do that in a way that's grounded and all of these kinds of things. But I get to be a bit of a disruptor. If I sit in a meeting and people are talking about things and I think that's not the right path, I have permission now to say that. And I think that is really, really important, because often when we talk about or think about innovation, we assume that innovation lives in certain places and with certain people. I have innovation in my title, which means I obviously do innovation at the organization. But people that don't have it in their title don't have a role. But I think when we start to talk about things like this, we start to actually acknowledge and recognize that everybody has a role in innovation and everybody has a role in it, and everybody gets to be part of that. And we see staff who come to work at Sagesse because they want to be a part of that idea of disruption and about really being able to deconstruct things and reconstruct them in a different kind of.
Yeah, thank you so much for diving into that. In my mind, it's like a trickle down effect that organizational words and meanings do have value to them and have an impact. And then you can see that trickle down into the staff, in your volunteer work, and everyone that then they
Totally.
support. So thank you so much for diving into that kind of structure a little bit. As we kind of enter the last questions, it's going to be about a call to listeners or anyone that might be interested. So if you could offer one challenge or invitation to our listeners, whether they are service providers, researchers, or advocates, what would that be?
So Carrie recently came across something that I absolutely love that I'm
You're
going
gonna
to say
steal my
probably
thing.
before. I know, I'm going to steal your thing.
I should have
If
gone
you'd like to
first.
say it, I'll let you take it.
No, you go ahead.
So Carrie recently came across something which I think actually in many ways is the heart of innovation, which is ask one more question than you feel comfortable with. Push your curiosity just a little bit farther.
The other thing that came out of this article was be a voyeur. It was really interesting because I think it actually takes us right back to the very beginning where we started with it, which is why the heck are you talking about the back of the bus? Go and sit in a coffee shop or in a co-working space or amongst your staff or amongst your colleagues and don't put headphones in. Don't close yourself off to what's happening. Just sit and just listen and observe and see how people are engaging and see the kinds of conversations that are happening. I recently did this. I have asked all of my staff to practice these things and then report back. And I recently did this. I sat at a coffee shop and I didn't put headphones in. And there was so many interesting points of connection and conversations around what was happening. There was, people that were talking about something that I thought, oh, I know about what they're talking about because of this thing that my brother does for work. And I understand that inherently in a way that most people would be like, oh, I don't understand that at all, or I don't know, right? And there was a family sitting beside me talking about this event that they're throwing and listening to that. And it was just so many points of interest and what's happening and why are people thinking about the things that they are and the way that they are. And so I think, to Andrea's point also, the ask one more question. Part of being innovative or thinking about this is being willing to find out what you don't know. And if we assume we know things, we're going to practice always from that place. But what if we don't know things? What does that mean? What does that look like? And what comes from that? I have a ton of things that come from something that has nothing to do with what we're doing.
Both very excellent different points. I really appreciate you two diving in and talking more about just being present, especially like what are people having conversations about? Can you push your curiosity just a little bit further in every space that you occupy?
I'm excited to hear what people think about this idea and to get to share it with folks. We've lived with it in our heads for so long that it feels a bit crazy for it to be out in the world.
Thanks for joining us on the Her Health podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.